Well, Merry Christmas. And in the spirit of the season, I wanted to read you a Christmas Bible verse. It's found in Matthew 2, starting in verse 18. It says, "A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead." Merry Christmas. Okay, so that is probably not the most standard Christmas verse that you're used to hearing, but it is a part of the Christmas story, and it is in response to an evil guy named Herod. Now, Herod is kind of the Walter White of the Bible, or Walter White is the Herod of TV. If you're not familiar with Walter White, there's a TV show called Breaking Bad that basically chronicles the evolution of a chemistry teacher to meth kingpin, and it shows how somebody can go from stand-up citizen to basically Scarface. And that's kind of true in the story of Herod. You know, he didn't start off all that bad. He was actually a pretty good ruler. He kept civil unrest down. Caesar Augustus put him in place because he was such a great tax collector and he was good with the economy. There was a point in which he melted his own personal gold down to stimulate the economy there in Jerusalem. And so it didn't seem like such a bad guy, but then he started letting pride and fear sink in. He named himself Herod the Great, and so he had somewhat of a pride complex. And he became so fearful that he started murdering people that he thought were going to usurp his throne. He even murdered a few of his sons. And here in this story, we see, okay, Jesus is born. He brings light into darkness, but sometimes when you put light into darkness, it sheds light on evil things that were lurking in the darkness. And that's true of Herod. And so we have these wise men. Now, a lot of people say, oh, 3 wise men came, but actually, the Bible doesn't say how many wise men there were, and they were called the Magi. Now, the Magi were people who would identify kings. And so you have Herod in the middle here, you have Rome, and then you have the Middle East, and Rome and the Middle East were like fighting and stuff, and so Herod sees the Magi coming, and we often see them in like little camels, and there's 3 of them, and it's a very beautiful scene. Well, these guys were so important. These guys were considered king makers that they would have been traveling with like thousands of people. And so you can imagine Herod is a little bit paranoid. He doesn't want his power usurped. He's murdering people because he doesn't want his power usurped. Then he sees the enemy of Rome coming, basically, with thousands of people. He loses his mind. And so in verse 7, it says, "Then Herod called for a private meeting with those wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, 'Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so I can go and worship him too.'" Obviously, that's not the case. He didn't really want to go and worship him. He probably wanted to go and murder him, and that's highlighted in what he does in verse 16. Herod was furious when he realized that the men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the first appearance of the star. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And that's the verse we read. "A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted." So you have 2 sets of stories. You have these wise men, the Magi, who came a great distance with a giant caravan to come and worship Jesus, worship the light of the world. Then you have Herod, Walter White, Heisenberg of the Bible, who is afraid of losing his power, and so now he wants to murder. He wants to stamp out the light of the world, all because he let a little bit of pride and fear sink into his heart and dictate how he was going to react to the greatest advent ever, Jesus Christ, God becoming flesh, God with us. So oftentimes in the Christmas story, we'll put ourselves in the shoes of the Magi, coming to worship Jesus. But we won't often put ourselves in the shoes of Herod, the evil dictator, ruler, paranoid baby killer. But the same poison that poisoned Herod's heart has a danger of poisoning our hearts. When we let pride sit on the throne of our hearts, when we let fear dictate our actions, we can miss out on the fact that the light of the world came to bring peace and joy to our lives because we're so preoccupied trying to control our own lives. Jesus came to be the Savior of the world, but he also came to be the king of your heart. And so when you remove pride and fear from the throne of your heart and replace it with Jesus, you could be a little bit more like the Magi and a little bit less like the Walter White of the Bible, Herod.